In the previous video, we were pondering the question of what happens after the United States, we complete westward expansion from East Coast to West Coast, but what happens when that expansion continues? And this time it's not continental, it's oceanic. We are traversing the Pacific from east to west. And we also acknowledge that on the continent, as we expanded, we adhered or followed the precedent of the Northwest Ordinance. And let's also recall the slogan operating at this time from East Coast to West Coast. Quote unquote, the Constitution follows the flag. Okay, but this time, this is a different type of westward movement. This is territory that's comprised of millions of, well, in racial terms, darker skinned people, the Filipinos, right? And that's in contrast to several thousand Native Americans that were left by 1890. So this is very different in racial terms. So, whereas in the continent we could still adhere to the Northwest Ordinance, we could still adhere to the slogan, the Constitution follows the flag, can we still adhere to it now that we are claiming new territory in a new frontier in the West, and that's the Philippines? So indeed, this is what occupied the minds of administrators, colonial administrators from the United States, the issue of citizenship, and even the issue of statehood. Should the Northwest Ordinance still be in effect? Well, the answer is, as it would turn out, no. Okay, and this is largely for racial reasons, as I just acknowledged, right? Indeed, it was hard to imagine both citizenship and statehood in non-white terms. For example, imagine, the Philippines as a state, right, with millions of Filipinos and very little American settlers, white American settlers, right? Because as we acknowledged a while back, the Philippines was never a, quote, settler colony. It's hard to imagine that. Even today, we don't have a state like that, right? Or imagine even in terms of, in our democracy, our democratic system as promulgated by the Constitution, right? There are millions of Filipinos, like I said, over 10 million likely, back in let's say 1900, 1905, at this time we're talking about. Well, what does that mean in terms of it being admitted to a state and then having elected representatives, right, in Congress? Well, if you know anything about the House of Representatives, it's based on population size of the state, right? So it's hard to imagine back then, especially, this populous state of brown-skinned people, having the most representatives in the House of Representatives, right? It's just something that was inconceivable, all right? So this actually led to something called the Insular Cases, which was issued by the Supreme Court in 1901. And what it did is alleviate the United States from the Northwest Ordinance when it came to overseas colonies. So in other words, well, let's remember again the slogan, the Constitution follows the flag. According to the Insular Cases, they're saying, no, that doesn't apply. Okay, why doesn't it apply according to the Insular Cases? Well, the Supreme Court declared that the Constitution only applies to incorporated territory, not unincorporated territory. You got that? Okay? The Constitution and the statehood, citizenship, and all that stuff, issues related to it, apply only to incorporated territory. And that basically means states, right, that were already formed at that time. Not unincorporated territory. And let's remember that term, unincorporated territory, that we introduced earlier. That is the U.S.'s designation for colony, rather than using the term colony, we came up with our own term, unincorporated territory. And again, here's a euphemism again at play, right? It's supposed to disguise the imperial venturism behind all this stuff. So hopefully you see what's going on here. This effectively resolved that contradiction between imperialism and democracy, and at the same time is justifying overseas colonialism here. So here I want to point out this very interesting condition that the Philippines and Filipinos are placed in as the United States begins to administer its colonial rule over their new colony, or as they said, unincorporated territory, right? And that's this interesting space of in-betweenness. They're sort of in this zone of in-betweenness, not only in racial terms, legal terms, and even geographic terms. Okay, so what do we mean by this, in-betweenness? Well, some of the stuff we already talked about. For example, racial status. Okay, think of savagery and civilization as two sides, right? Two polar opposites, in fact, is a way to think about it, right? There's the savage race, right? And usually it connected to darker skin. And then there's the civilized race, and usually that's connected to whiter skin. Back then, of course. So here are the Filipinos, no longer savages, as we discuss in our racial reconstruction of the Filipinos. Yet we know they're not civilized whites, right? Rather, they're in between those two polar opposites, okay? And the term, as we know, is little brown brothers. So there we go. They're in between the two sides. Also seen in the legal status of Filipinos. We know they're not colonial subjects. What do we mean by that? It's because the United States does not want to use the term colonial subject. That is indeed something that the European empires did in their effort to, colonize areas, and they referred to the subjugated people, the racial groups in these areas, as subjects of the empire, right? Subjects to the king or queen at that time, right? We're not a monarchy, however, the United States, right? We don't have subjects, right? We're actually comprised of citizens in our country, not subjects. Yet we know that citizenship is not going to be extended to Filipinos, as we just discussed. So therefore, legally, what's conjured up is this new legal status, and the term is wards, or used at the same time with wards, U.S. nationals. Okay, both terms are in between. They're not colonial subjects, and by the way, you could even think of it in terms of foreigner or alien, as we think of today when we think about your status in the United States, right? They're not aliens, they're not foreigners, and certainly not colonial subjects, yet at the same time, they're not citizens. So, rather, they are in between. They're wards of the state, or U.S. nationals. So there we go again with that in-betweenness. And look at it as a solution, right, to think about, how to conceive our new colonial subjects, right? Now, even geographically, it's expressed here with the Philippines, and this is something we talked about earlier. This notion of the Philippines not being a colony, because that's what European empires did, that were oppressive and often brutal in their rule, right? We were more enlightened. That's how we thought. At the same time, we know it's not going to be admitted as a state, as what happened with the Northwest Ordinance. So, rather, it's unincorporated territory. So again, this is indeed in between, right? In between a colony, in between a foreign country, yet it's not a state, right? It's unincorporated territory. And by the way, think of the juxtaposition of these two terms, unincorporated, juxtaposed against the term territory, okay? They're almost well, you can almost imagine them as being opposite to each other, right? One is not part of something, yet a territory usually denotes something that's part of the area, right? So interesting, again, juxtaposition. It seems to suggest that this territory, in this case the Philippines, and certainly you could apply this to Puerto Rico, it belongs to the United States, yet it's not part of the United States, right? It belongs to, yet not a part of the United States. It's in between. Now, here is a term that I didn't put on the slide, but it's an interesting term to discuss not only this in betweenness, but the way Asians in general, not just Filipinos, are going to be thought of in terms of national belonging. Okay, in the beginning of this history of Asians coming to the United States, and we'll see this more in future topics, Asians are not going to be considered as fully belonging to the country, right? Yet at the same time, it's not like they're entirely excluded, at least not throughout, this period of history, as we'll discuss, right? The Asians that happened to be here as immigrants were part of the United States, yet they truly don't belong, right? Just like unincorporated territory. So a good term to think about this is called differential inclusion. And this is a more academic way of thinking about that state of Asians, their condition of being a part of, they are, physically in the United States, but they're not belonging at the same time. All right. So hopefully you can see how that applies here to the colonial architecture that's happening, whether we're talking about geography, legal status, or even race, right? The architectonic of racial configuration here. Now, again, I was invoking this idea of in between with Asians in general, but now we're talking about Filipinos as colonial subjects. Okay, that's very different. When we talked about the Chinese, they weren't colonial subjects. Japanese, they weren't colonial subjects. Filipinos, they are colonial subjects, even though we don't call them colonial subjects, right? They're wards. But let's be real, they are colonial subjects. So all this in-betweenness is going to foreshadow Filipino in-betweenness, their positionality as eventual immigrants that will journey from let's use our term, metropole from the periphery to the metropole, right? You're going to see future migratory waves of especially workers for agribusiness, agricultural workers and cannery work in like Alaska and Washington State, working in the canneries. Some will be in the Navy. Some will be nurses. That's going to start a little bit later, but still, there'll be a significant number of Filipino women that'll become nurses. And then later, other types of Filipino immigrants, right? But again, you have to think of them, especially at this stage of their historical experience, as being in this zone of in-betweenness. And also at this time, they are still employed as a source of cheap labor. Okay, so that theme never really leaves. By the way, I just mentioned Puerto Rico. What about Puerto Rico? Are they going to be thought of the same way in terms of race, especially? Well, here's what's interesting about this. Puerto Rico becomes annexed as unincorporated territory, and today it is still called unincorporated territory, by the way, okay? Puerto Ricans, however, back then in the early 1900s were deemed to be white, not Asiatic, not Oriental. Therefore, they were granted citizenship in 1917. Therefore, the Constitution followed the flag for Puerto Ricans, but it's still in between, okay? They are U.S. citizens, but they cannot vote in elections. Nor does Puerto Rico have representatives in Congress, like senators and congressmen. Okay, so it's still this form of differential inclusion, interestingly enough, but applied to Puerto Ricans.